Welcome to Athletes OnBalance, where we talk to athletes, coaches, and experts about mental health and sports. This is a stigma-free zone for inner thoughts and outer conversations. We're helping athletes and anyone with mental health challenges perform at their best, on and off the field.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Athletes OnBalance. I'm your host, Walt Norley, the founder and CEO of OnBalance Health. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Dr. Brian Hainline, the NCAA's Chief Medical Officer. Dr. Hainline has been the leader in sports medicine for over 40 years, serving as the NCAA's inaugural Chief Medical Officer since 2013. Under Dr. Hainline's guidance, the NCAA Sports Science Institute was established, focusing on athlete safety and wellness. Dr. Hainline spearheaded initiatives addressing mental health and concussions, shaping policies to prioritize athlete well-being. Dr. Hainline is also retiring at the end of this month of May, so that's only 11 days away. I thought you're counting.
That's right.
Dr. Hainline, thank you very much for joining me today in Athletes OnBalance. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, I want to go through a little bit of historical, and then I'd like to jump in modern and wrap up with future. So you were the inaugural Chief Medical Officer. Why was this initiated, and what was your interest in coming in and taking on this role?
Yeah, so this really was a vision of then President Mark Emmert, that the NCAA was founded in 1906 on health and safety matters, really focusing just on the sport of football. The NCAA was created specifically to make football safer, and we're still working on that. Right. But Mark thought that there should be a leadership position that looks at health and safety, and there's really a spokesperson for that at the NCAA. And it was a novel concept because actually we were the first national governing body, either from the Olympic side or on the professional side in America, to have a full-time chief medical officer. Yeah. And after that was created, then the NFL came on board, the NBA, NHL, Major League Baseball, and then several of the Olympic governing bodies. And we were actually the second in the world. FIFA had a chief medical officer position, and they were the first, and then we became the second. So it really was a trend-setting thing that there should be a spokesperson, but really someone who's going to work to collaborate and find innovative ways to advance sport as a public health good.
So in your initial years, what did you have, kind of a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 missions that you were focused on?
Yeah, so the first was really creating a mission statement, and that meant meeting with the membership and the board of governors and so forth, and it stands today to promote and develop safety excellence and wellness in college student athletes, and to foster lifelong physical and mental health. So even from the beginning, we envisioned physical and mental health as being one. So that was one thing. The second was actually I decided I was going to put on roller skates and travel across the country and visit as many schools as I could. And I visited a few hundred schools. And that really was to find out what's going on at the school level, because the NCAA is not a top-down organization. It's a membership organization. It's really run by the schools. And so it was really getting an idea of what's happening at the school level and to try to build some trust. The third thing, in 2013 when I started, that was concussion was front and center in the news. And it was front and center in the New York Times as well. And there was this idea that maybe concussion and chronic traumatic encephalopathy were interlinked. And so it was really trying to understand how we could advance the cause of concussion. And that ended up taking a considerable amount of my time, and ultimately being the architect of the NCAA Department of Defense Care Consortium study, which ended up being an incredible agreement with the DoD, the 4 service academies, and 26 other NCAA member schools. And we're still tracking, hopefully up to over 25 years, 55,000 student athletes and cadets. And it's the most definitive concussion and head impact study ever done. And then the last really was mental health. My first week on the job, I met with what's called members of the National Student Athlete Advisory Committee from Division I, Division II, and Division III. And they all told me exactly the same thing. They said, look, Dr. Hainline, we get concussion, but can you please make mental health your priority?
Wow.
And I listened to them and I said, I'll do that. So that really were the four things that drove my initial days.
It's really interesting. A couple comments to that. One, I know you have your medical background's neurology, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So I would assume that, from that perspective, you probably gravitated a little bit to, the concussion studies and some of the, learned statistical knowledge to put it in protocols. On the concussion side, because we obviously know, I got two questions on that. One is, what has happened from those initial studies to today with what I'd call preventative measures that came from the last 5, 10, really, I guess the last 5, 10 years from your tenure?
I think the most important thing is that the concept of treating concussion seriously and preventing concussion, there's universal buy-in across the 1,100 schools. And that really came from an awful lot of data and over 150 publications on outlining exactly what a concussion is and understanding that if someone returns to play too quickly, and we had exceptional data on this, they were much more likely to develop a repeat concussion within the first 10 days. And that if you don't report concussion and you don't have it managed immediately, that you're likely to be out much longer than if you report immediately and you get proper management. And I think the other thing that has been really important is we just understand for the first time much more objectively what a concussion is and what it isn't. So a concussion is not a precursor to developing chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And people recover from concussion, but importantly, it's how you manage concussion. That depends on how you recover, and it's a very hands-on approach. When we started this study, the prevailing wisdom was that if you have a concussion, you should be managed by what we call cocoon therapy, go into a dark, quiet space until you're better. And that's actually the worst possible treatment.
Really?
It's really getting people engaged much more immediately, exercising after 24 hours, and taking a very targeted approach to where your symptoms are. So, and I'll just step forward that within 1 or 2 years, I think we're going to have real-time point-of-care blood testing where we'll have biomarkers available and we'll get diagnostic measures like we can for heart attacks and things like that. We'll have that within minutes. So a lot has changed considerably.
That's amazing. Actually, as a former college football player, I've been concussed, and you're right. I mean, it's a long time ago. When there was no studies, it was smelling salt, go back in the huddle. But it was the darkness and, keeping still and lack of movement and all that. I mean, so you have different severity levels there, right? And you're saying with these biomarkers that are coming to the industry at some point soon, they're going to be able to determine the seriousness, the severity level as well.
Yes, and that's really, really exciting. We now can differentiate mild. I mean, I hate to use the word mild and more severe concussion. That's a whole other thing. The whole definition of concussion and staging of it is going to shift considerably, and that's probably within the next 2 years. But more severe concussions can be differentiated from less severe concussions by way of blood-based biomarkers. But also importantly, we have an MRI protocol, so magnetic resonance imaging of the brain. And we can, with a combination of biomarkers and MRI, you can predict recovery. You can actually have a prognostic indicator of how long it's going to take. So all of that's going to be prime time, I think, within the next 2 to 3 years. It's truly exciting how that's been evolving and pretty quickly.
I love that. I do. I love it on several fronts. As you know, I'm on the technology side of it. So it's just a beautiful thing when technology comes in for all the right purposes, and ultimately it's helping human beings. Go back to mental health for a second, and I'm going to move off from the concussions, but Um, what do the studies show in terms of, a typical athletic department, the concussion situation that's tied to maybe comorbidity of a depression cycle or a mental health episode? Have those numbers been correlated, in terms of what percentage of athletes within an athletic department?
Well, so if we just go across the board a bit, I think in addressing concussion, about 10% of athletes are going to develop a concussion. And there are higher risk sports. It's actually the highest risk is not football. The higher risk sports are wrestling. Women's ice hockey is a higher risk than men's football. And so, but you take for the contact collision sports, it's going to be 10%. When you look at then the correlation of mental health and concussion, we have to separate different aspects of mental health. So there's anxiety, there's depression, there are sleep disorders, which are exceptionally important in mental health. You can't untangle sleep from mental health. And when you look at concussion symptoms, even the concussion symptom checklist, the majority of them are mental health symptoms, difficulty concentration, becoming anxious, having difficulty sleeping, having difficulty falling asleep or awakening too early, and all sorts of anxiety measures. And so a very large number of patients who develop concussion have mental health symptoms, but if they are managed properly, they will dissipate, and most will dissipate within a period of 2 weeks.
Wow, that's interesting. So let me go to more current. You mentioned that the student athlete body on the forefront wanted mental health on the forefront. You just released recently your second edition of mental health care for guidelines for collegiate athletics. What are some of the most I would say milestone elements that evolve from edition 1 to edition 2 within these new guidelines?
Well, even going back to the creation of the first edition of what we call NCAA mental health best practices, we first had a task force. And so the way we've developed all of our best practices is through summits, task forces, and the like. And we bring in experts from around the country. In this case, we had 25 of the leading mental health, medical, and science organizations in the country that endorsed this first edition of the mental health best practices, saying what is in here is based on all of the evidence is the best way to address mental health at the collegiate level. And of course, we have representation from the NCAA, the student athletes, coaches, and everything. I even remember that first task force. At some point, everyone broke down in tears and said, it mostly was, I can't believe we're actually addressing mental health and then addressing some of the really serious issues of mental health, not just student athletes, but students in general. And then coaches crying and saying, I think this is great. We're addressing mental health for our athletes. Who's addressing mental health for the coaches? And so it was one of the more exceptional summits I've ever been in. When we moved to the second edition, which was released in January, and actually it becomes official this August, meaning that every member school must put in place policies, education, and practices that are consistent with the second edition. And what drove the second edition were a few things. One is just saying, look, we need to update the best practices in general. But then there were some specific concerns. Mental health from the point of view of addressing mental health in student athletes of color, in the LGBTQ plus community, and international student athletes. And there was widespread recognition that in those three groups especially, that there was under-recognition and under-management of mental health issues. Another was looking at gambling and corruption in sport, tying that with social media and the impact on mental health. Unfortunately, one of the things that I've had to investigate and get involved in is the horrific abuse that happens to athletes at all walks of life on social media. And a lot of it is directly correlated to gambling and corruption in sport. So you have a bad outcome from a gambler's point of view, and what that gambler can put on someone's social media, especially women's social media. I mean, it's just the misogyny and the sexual violence. It's beyond imagination, and the impact that has on athletes and how we address that from a mental health point of view. And another emerging topic was NIL, name, image, and likeness. And you have athletes who are really caught up in name, image, and likeness, and I think for good reasons. I really favor that athletes are being compensated from that point of view. But what is the interplay between NIL, the contractual obligations, the pressure to fulfill them, and how that may impact one's mental health? So those were three compelling issues that we added into the second edition, plus just updating it in general.
Well, so NIL, everything you just mentioned, because what I was going to say, even prior to asking that question, there's a quote unquote mental health crisis in collegiate athletics. You probably saw it. The British Sports Journal just came out with something which was restated by CNN that over the last 20 years that suicide rates with student athletes have doubled. What's the cause of this? It has a lot to do with what you just mentioned.
Well, so with suicide, and I should say in the second edition, one of the other things that we covered, which was not in the first edition, is this concept of suicide contagion. So that you can have a suicide and then people talk about that in the community, and the next thing you know, you have 2 or 3 suicides. And so I hate to use the word copycat, but the more official word is contagion. We don't understand it well, but there's something to that. But if we look at the rates of suicide having doubled in student athletes, it's also more than doubled in students in general. And so one has to be careful not to say that suicide is particular to student athletes. It really is particular to emerging adults in the 18 to 22-year-old age category and the vulnerabilities that go with that. Right. When we look at student athlete mental health in general and compare it to mental health in students who are not athletes, student athletes are much more protected against developing mental health symptoms and disorders from the point of view of depression, anxiety, and the like. So that data remains very strong. And when we look at the primary triggers in student athletes for mental health symptoms and disorders, it's actually not sport performance. It's the same sort of things you would expect in their non-athlete peers. Financial concerns, or breaking up with a significant other, or family issues at home, or your self-identity. And so that also is really important data to understand. So we need to get inside the head of the student athlete, but also understand they're part of a demographic of what we call emerging adults who are vulnerable in general.
Yeah, so everything you just mentioned, again, what I've been exposed to is the non-clinical diagnosis and treatment. One thing that I've been exposed to in a pretty significant way in my short journey with OnBalance Health has been a lot of the progressive programs, I'll call it the sports medicine programs, believe on that intersection between the mind and the body. So I had Nick Saban on the podcast about a year ago when he was still coaching, and obviously he's had great success. He's a very interesting guy. He recruited me to play football at Ohio State, and I've known him for a long, long time. That progressive mentality, and then that organization with Alabama, which I know you're well aware of, they have that mentality of within reason, with sensitivity on the mental side, to share enough data so that the people on the athletic side, the trainers and the coaches, understand that holistic view of getting that athlete back into competition, and that is, in a lot of ways, that is the driver, unless somebody's in a clinical situation that's very severe. You mentioned as part of the guidelines, and you mentioned the summit about coaches saying, what about us? I mean, I know this is kind of a swag type question in terms of, and maybe there is data, but it seems to me that with the programs that don't have it, a lot of the trepidations that the student athlete has is they don't want to be judged. They don't want to, from peers as well, teammates and coaches, lose their position, get knocked down on a depth chart. I mean, all those sensitivities. It seems like the coaches really need to get educated on what I talked about with Nick Saban, that understanding that in order to perform, you have to be as well up here as your shoulder, your ankle, and your knee. What's your perspective on the coaching community getting educated so they understand that as a whole?
Well, first, speaking of Nick Saban, and I have the privilege of knowing him very well too. And I remember the first time I visited Alabama, and Coach Saban sat down with me, and he said, "Doc, in the next 30 minutes, tell me everything you know about sleep." So he knew that there was a correlation between sleep and mental health disorders. When we're sleep deprived, we're much more likely to have suicidal ideation. He also knew there was a correlation between sleep and performance. And so he already was rather progressive. And I think Alabama has one of the best mental health programs in the country. And that's a little bit because of the top-down approach that Nick Saban has. Their football players have exceptional mental and physical health care, but that mental health care model applies to all of the sports, and that is because of Nick. One of the things that we have what's called the SSI Spotlight Series, and for the listeners, feel free to tune in on any of them. There are about 10 on mental health. The first one we held was looking at Ole Miss, and what they did is they educated every single one of their coaches and athletic staff on mental health first aid. And mental health first aid is this concept of how do you learn to understand, address, and manage mental health. And what those coaches got out of that was absolutely exceptional. They all felt that they had a better handle on it, and even that they had a better handle on taking care of themselves from a mental health point of view. And I think when we get to performance, and look, coaches are very data-driven, and the most impactful thing we've had to say to coaches, and I think the message has been driven home because of this, is that there's a direct correlation between mental and physical health. We know with certainty that mental health disorders can predict musculoskeletal injuries. We know with certainty that sleep deprivation and sleep disorders will predict overuse injuries more than overtraining will. We know that mental health disorders predispose to poor performance. And we know that if you are injured and you develop a mental health disorder while you're healing from the injury is going to be more prolonged unless the mental health disorder is addressed. So there's such a mind-body interaction. And so ultimately, the message we're delivering to coaches is mental health symptoms and disorders need to be addressed like an ankle sprain. And it's basically that simple. And if you don't address an ankle sprain, you're going to end up with an unstable ankle and a potential very serious injury. It's the same with mental health.
Well, I mean, where does that start from an organizational standpoint? We talk about Nick, and he's obviously exceptional. I didn't realize he was a psych major, and he did his master's in human behavior. That in itself makes him unusual, but is this, he's obviously, an exception's exception. Does it start with the athletic director? Where in the organization does this mentality start so that the coaching community gets educated to the level you just mentioned with Ole Miss?
Well, I think it started, interestingly enough, with the entire NCAA membership. So for the listeners, for legislation, bylaws, and the like, that has to be voted on by the membership from D3, D2, and D1. And a few years ago, the membership voted to pass a bylaw that every school must have in place, and I mentioned this earlier, mental health education and practices management consistent with the NCAA mental health best practices. Then what we did within the Sports Science Institute was reached out to all of the member schools and said there has to be a top-down and a bottom-up approach at every member school. The top-down means that, look, the CEO of every member school, that's the president,
Right.
has to make mental health a priority within athletics, and then that becomes the athletics director's responsibility, and that every coach understands that they need to address mental health with their athletes in the same way that they address physical health. The bottom up is really working with the student athletes, and especially through the national, regional, and then local student athlete advisory committee members, that they're really taking a peer-to-peer approach of protecting one another, bystander intervention approaches, where it's the buddy system, and they understand that everyone needs to be part of that system. So it really was this combination approach, and then doing much more targeted education specifically for the coaches and working with the various coaching organizations. So it's been a tremendous journey, and a lot of trial and error and trying to figure out what really is going to stick.
Whether it's D1, D2, or 3, what are the challenges to monitor adherence to these programs? I mean, is it local, or is it regional? Is it national?
So it really is local. So the NCAA, looking at the Sports Science Institute or enforcement, I mean, there's no way you can oversee 500,000 student athletes and 1,100 member schools. And indeed, constitutionally, within the Constitution, we're not expected to. So the care and the oversight of the care is all local, and that's as it should be. Right. And so there's this new position that was created a few years ago as well. So legislation was passed called independent medical care legislation, and it had two parts to it. The first part is that all medical decisions and all return to play, the empowerment of that comes at the primary athletics healthcare providers, which is the team physician and the athletic trainer. So it has nothing to do with the coaches. No one can interfere with that. And the second part of the legislation is that every school must have in place an athletics healthcare administrator. And that position really is like a compliance officer for all medical legislation, including mental health. I will say that took a little bit longer to really come home for everyone to understand that this new athletics healthcare administrator, this compliance officer, is extremely important. But if we look at the D1 model right now, and as that's rolling out, the holistic model, they have made the athletics healthcare administrator the pivotal person on campus for assuring compliance. And we've been pushing that point home with D2 and D3 as well.
So we talked about some some of the larger budget organizations like Alabama and an Ole Miss, just some of the examples that do have Gold Star programs. Just ironically, I had Dr. Josie Nicholson on this last week, and she's wonderful.
She's a gem.
Yeah, she's wonderful. I love what she's doing with Helinski's Hope. But again, this. Are they exceptional? I mean, is that all resource driven that they're able to do that? And what limitations when you're not in that, stratosphere?
Yeah. So look, they're exceptional from the point of view of being Gold Star exceptional, but they aren't the exception. And early on, although this was a D1, the MAC conference, they reached out to us, and we visited the MAC conference, and this was, back in like 2016, 17, and they created a model of mental health care for every single school in that conference, and it was really exceptional. And the D2 and D3 schools, so we've worked very, very closely with what we call the President's Council and the Management Councils of Division II and Division III, and their National Student Athlete Advisory Committee members. And we rolled out and said, look at the best practices. For the most part, they're resource independent. If you're going to have an athletics program, you have to have mental health care, you have to have an athletic trainer, you have to have physical health care. So you're already making a commitment to some sort of resources. But when you really put in place an environment that fosters well-being, identifying who the mental health providers are that are licensed, which could be local, or they could be with student healthcare in general, and that you have protocols that you rehearse. None of that is really requires much in the way of resources. So we've driven that point home. And yeah, you have these gold star exceptional performances, but I really have been quite encouraged to see that the recognition of mental health care in a relatively resource independent way has been rolled out across all three divisions.
But I would assume I'm going to talk a little bit about, going forward into the future. I hear this word all the time, and I'm sure you do, the difference between reactive care and proactive care, right? And I'm positive that your perspective is everything has to be proactive care. What are your sentiments on technology to help proactive care? We just talked about the insights with the biomarkets and what be coming in the next 2 years on the concussion front. What's your perspective of what's needed from, we've got, AI, and we've got, MI, machine intelligence, ML, machine learning. What's your perspective on that level of technology being able to improve the mental health care management within the student athletes?
Well, I think one technology which really came about out of necessity, and that was during COVID, was virtual mental health care. So doesn't seem, that's not AI driven and this and that, but the ability to have 24/7 virtual mental health care. And for some of the under-resourced schools that you don't even have licensed mental health providers in the community, virtual care is exceptional. And you can gain insight on virtual care that you don't have when you're in sort of a staged office. You're actually looking at potentially the chaos in someone's room or the chaos going on behind them. I think in terms of AI-driven apps and so forth, I'm very encouraged that there's a lot of research in that. I think we're still awaiting the results on all of that. So, but I think that is encouraging. The other thing, I wouldn't call it technology-driven per se, but it is going to be incorporated into some apps that I'm aware of. That's for the first time. So I'll take a step back. In 2018, the International Olympic Committee held their first ever international summit on mental health and elite athletes. And I was privileged to be co-chair of that with Claudia Reardon. And as part of that conference, and the publications all came out in 2019, British Journal of Sports Medicine, we developed a working group to put together, for the first time in the history of mental health care, sport-specific screening tools. And so what developed from that was the Sports Mental Health Assessment Tool and the Sports Mental Health Recognition Tool. Vincent Gudebars was the chair of that working group. And now there are apps that are working in really creative ways to incorporate those screening tools into the apps. And what's important is that, yeah, there are some very sport-specific needs that have to be addressed in screening. Let me just flash forward. The IOC has now decided that just like every 4 years, 4 to 6 years, there's an international consensus statement on concussion, and I've been part of those groups. They are going to have in June of 2025 their second International Olympic Committee consensus meeting on mental health and elite athletes. So this will be version 2, and the anticipation is we're going to repeat this cycle every 4 to 5 years. So long-winded answer, addressing some technology and some emerging ideas that are going to be happening.
Along those lines of kind of the future, if you theoretically came back 5 years from now, what would you hope that you would see that has changed from today?
I think a few things. One is that we would have more perfected the idea of how you actually create an environment that supports wellness. We really are searching for sort of the nirvana of that, and it's going to look different at different campuses. But regardless of how much technology you have, if the environment is truly not fostering and developing wellness and mental health care seeking, everything else is very remotely secondary. I think the second, I'm not certain, actually, we're going to have, just as I mentioned earlier with concussion for brain imaging and objective biomarkers, I don't see that on the horizon, that we're going to have, sort of the holy grail of functional brain MRI or blood biomarkers that are going to be so predictive. I do think that with applications on the horizon, especially for screening and how we do that in targeted ways. So right now, there's not a methodology for screening and people sort of just do it at the beginning of the year. But there should be a way that screening is linked to what we call periodization and major life events. And so it's done in a targeted way. So periodization, meaning after a major event or when you're sort of in your downslope of training, or major life events, you've lost a loved one, or you've suddenly been cut from the team, or you develop an injury. We have to figure out how to do targeted screening better. And I think finally, just the way that we can take advantage of licensed mental health care providers. And I think largely through virtual mental health, that's going to be much more accessible. So those are some of the things I see in the future that will be important.
Well, you've had an illustrious career, and you've been involved in the dramatic improvement in the entire well-being of the student athlete. As you look back a little bit, are there some moments and projects and implementations that you're most proud of?
I think I would put at the top the concussion study. We're now in what's called the CARE Saltos integrated study phase. So Saltos stands for Service Academy Longitudinal Traumatic Brain Injury Outcome Study. So we have completely interlinked the follow-up care of our cadets into their military career, as well as student athletes. So we're tracking prospectively 55,000 student athletes and cadets. And all of them are being screened by general screening tools. And then we randomly selected 2,000, 1,000 from service academies, 500 who had high head impact exposure, 500 who didn't, and then 1,000 from the student athletes, same sort of differential. And those individuals are going to undergo very, very detailed studies on a yearly, every other year basis, including PET scans, brain MRI, blood biomarkers, genetics, genomics, plus detailed in-person screening. And all of this is being put under a very large umbrella of what we call the Warfighter Brain Health Initiative. And the idea for the Warfighter Brain Health Initiative is, how can you predict brain health? That's really, if we could figure that out, I mean, that's a key to humanity. Yeah. And by having this study go out 25 years, we're actually able to look at the medical records of the academy cadets and to follow that. And so we're not just looking at concussion, repetitive head impact exposure, we're looking at the impact of social determinants of health, the development of the metabolic syndrome, obesity and the like, the development of substance misuse, and how that impacts brain health. So this study, it's the Framingham of concussion, head impact exposure, and really looking at brain health. So I think that's the thing I'm most proud of. And the second is that the Sports Science Institute has become a trusted voice, and we have a collaborative working relationship with 25 to 30 scientific sports medicine medical organizations, where everyone has come together and said, you know what, the NCAA may be in the best position out of all of the national governing bodies, professional or amateur, in this country to look at sport as a public health matter. And now there's this collaborative relationship where everyone wants to help. And so that's what led to the development of mental health best practices, or looking at catastrophic injury, or looking at cardiac health care, and so many more. So yeah, those two really stand out on top. It's just been a privilege, and I mean, in many ways, it's been like a sacred journey. It's just been so incredible.
Well, as I said earlier, college athletics, and they translate to society as a whole, are better because of your tenure and your leadership. One of the last things I like to ask all my guests, Dr. Hainline, and it comes down to some pretty interesting answers, is who in your life in your life journey has been most inspirational?
Oh, geez. So this comes back to college. So when I was in college, my major was philosophy. That was at Notre Dame, and I was a student athlete in tennis, and just philosophy in general. It just opened my mind and changed the foundation of who I am. But there was this one teacher in particular, Joe Evans, and I took a few classes from him, including an independent study on Jacques Maritain, who was a French philosopher. He was the first major philosopher who actually was part of the resistance in France against the Nazis. And so he was a bold, forward-thinking person. But Joe Evans, I think it's like he's part of everything of who I am, and understanding just the gratitude that we must have for being on this planet and really being conscious and sentient beings. I mean, it's pretty remarkable when we really think about it. And I think the second person really was my brother John, who was my tennis coach and my tennis partner and my soulmate. He passed away, unfortunately, a little more than a year ago. But just looking at tennis as a metaphor for life, just as sport as a metaphor for life, and that's so deeply embedded in me. So those two stand out. Well, I would add my wife of 45 years, but that's a different sort of relationship. But she's really helped shape the essence of who I am.
Well, thank you very much again for joining us today. As I mentioned, I think college athletics owes you a debt of gratitude for your leadership. And, ultimately, your body of work here was to elevate care at every level in the health element of the student athlete, and creating, a holistic view of it, and taking on areas that really weren't being touched upon, prior to your arrival. So congratulations on a tremendous career with the NCAA. Thank you finally to our listening audience. We continue to drive our mission to eliminate the stigma associated with mental health in athletics. Be well, everyone. This is Walt Norley, and this is Athletes on Balance.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Athletes on Balance. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please follow us on your preferred podcast app to catch our next episode. Join our community by sharing with an athlete, mental health care provider, or coach in your circle.